Imagine a place that has been the literal center of the world for nearly 10 centuries. Beijing, the heart of the planet's biggest empire. Northern conquerors smashed through its gates. Entire dynasties turned to dust here, while foreign boots stomped across its plazas. We're talking about a city older than almost every nation on your map today. It's been torched, scrubbed of its name, shamed, and then miraculously brought back to life. 3,000 years of raw memory are baked into these streets. This is the complete, brutal story of Beijing. It all begins with the land. Pull up a map of China and look where the jagged northern peaks finally crash into the endless southern plains. Right there, in that narrow pinch point, where the hills squeeze into a corridor and the freezing steppe winds howl through. That's the spot. Beijing didn't end up there by luck. If you want to rule the north, you can't look away from this place. You either own this dirt, or you're at the mercy of whoever does. But long before the grand palaces or the Great Wall, people were already carving out a life here. Digging deep, archaeologists found Homo erectus living in nearby caves roughly 250,000 years ago. They call him Peking Man, found at Zukudian. By 27,000 years ago, Paleolithic humans were roaming the same ground. We're talking about a stretch of time that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. The first real seed of a city finally sprouts during the Western Zhou dynasty. Somewhere around the 11th century BC, the Zhou emperor starts handing out land like poker chips, and one northern plot becomes a tiny settlement called Ji. It was just a modest capital for a small kingdom, a rough frontier town clinging to the very edge of Chinese civilization. Then the Warring States period hits, and the entire board gets flipped. Tiny Ji gets swallowed whole by the rising state of Yuan, one of the 7 heavy hitters, brawling for control of all China. Yuan moves its capital to Ji, and suddenly, this place matters. It's not just some local outpost anymore. Now, it's the nerve center for a major player in one of the most cutthroat political wars in human history. To keep the northern nomads at bay, those fierce tribes roaming the open steppes, the kingdom of Yuan starts building walls. Not the stone wonders you see on Instagram. These were humble earthworks, built 15 centuries before the Ming turned walls into masterpieces. Still, the fear was the same. That border was a death trap, and someone had to hold the line. This bloody era finally ends when one kingdom, the Qin, systematically crushes every single rival. In 221 BC, Qin Shi Huang becomes the first man to unite China. He burns the old ways to the ground. Ji, once the proud capital of Yuan, is demoted to just another boring paperwork hub in a massive, centralized empire. Its spotlight flickered out. At least, for a while. For the next millennium, the future Beijing stays relevant, but sidelined. Think about that, 1,000 years. Most countries don't even last that long. Yet, it spends this entire epoch as a provincial town, strategically vital, sure, but it's never the throne. After the Qin fall, the Han take over from 206 BC to 220 AD. The city sat right on the edge of the civilized world, staring down the Xiongnu, a massive confederation of nomadic warriors from the plains. The friction between China and these nomads defined the entire age. Raids, tension, blood, walls, bribes, diplomacy, and flat-out slaughter. A cycle that never seemed to break. Then, the Han dynasty finally snaps. China shatters into the 3 kingdoms. Empires rise and vanish: the Jin, the 16 kingdoms, the Northern Wei, for 3 long centuries. From the fall of Western Jin in 317 AD to the Sui in 581, the north belongs to outsiders. Xiongnu, Xianbei, and other tribes who had finally forced their way across the border. The city of Yuan changed owners like a used car. That's just life on the frontier. The Sui dynasty pulls China back together for a heartbeat, then implodes under the weight of its own ego. The Tang take the wheel in 618 AD, renaming the city Yozhou. By now, it's a massive military hub, the brain of the northern defense. But in 755, a general named Lushan launches a monstrous rebellion from this very city. The Lushan rebellion shreds the Tang Empire and leaves tens of millions dead. It's one of the bloodiest chapters in human history. After the smoke cleared, everything was different. The Tang never truly recover, and the dynasty just slowly bleeds out for over 100 years. It finally dies in 907. China shatters again. But this time, the northern nomads are playing for keeps. They aren't just raiding for loot anymore. They're building their own empires right on China's doorstep. In 936, the later Jin dynasty makes a desperate deal that would haunt China for the next 400 years. Imagine you're so desperate for soldiers that you just hand over the keys to your northern gate. That's exactly what happens when a huge stretch of the frontier, including the dirt that would become modern Beijing, is gifted to the Khitan people from Manchuria. They call themselves the Liao dynasty, and what they do next is actually genius. They don't just bleed the land dry like most conquerors. They have a much bigger plan. They build, they govern. They look at the flat plains of Beijing and see pure, unadulterated potential. In the year 938, they set up a second capital right here, calling it Nanjing, which just means southern capital. It's one of 5 hubs across their empire, and it's about to change everything. It's a multi-layered government system that would have looked like pure science fiction to most Western empires of that era. The Liao run the show until the early 12th century. That's when a new nightmare arrives from Manchuria. Meet the Jurchens, the founders of the Jin dynasty. And no, don't confuse them with the other Jins you've heard about. They play a dirty game. They team up with the Song dynasty to wipe out the Liao, then immediately turn their swords on their own allies. Honestly, don't even be surprised. In this part of the world, that's just how power has worked for 1,000 years, and by 1125, the Liao are history. Then, in 1153, the Jin emperor makes a move that cements this city's destiny forever. He doesn't want a secondary base. He moves his entire throne and the heart of his empire right here. For the first time ever, the city now renamed Zhongdu. The central capital isn't just a frontier outpost, it's the most important place in a major dynasty. The Jin go big. We're talking massive palaces, walls, and towers. By 1207, the population explodes from 82,000 to nearly 400,000 people. Marco Polo's bridge? That's the Lugu Bridge, built in 1189 just southwest of the city. This is also where the world's first paper money starts changing hands. If you visit Beihai Park today, you're walking on ground the Jin elite claimed back in 1179 as their private imperial retreat. By any measure, the city is thriving. But look north. A storm is coming. The Mongols. Genghis Khan is systematically erasing everything in his path. In 1211, Mongol armies finally pour into northern China. 2 years later, Genghis himself is camping in the northern suburbs of Zhongdu, watching his 3 oldest sons starve out a city protected by 900 towers and triple moats. The Jin try to buy their way out with land and a princess. It works until the Jin court makes a fatal, boneheaded mistake. They try to sneak the capital south to Kaifeng. When Genghis finds out, he doesn't just get mad, he sees it as a total betrayal. He comes back for blood. In 1215, after the residents are forced to eat anything to survive, Zhongdu finally breaks. 100,000 soldiers and countless families surrender. But Genghis doesn't care. He lets his men loot and burn the entire place to the ground. The palaces burn for over a month. Sifting through the ashes, the Mongols find a brilliant Khitan advisor named Yelu Chukai. He looks the great conqueror in the eye and tells him something he never even considered. You can win an empire on horseback, but you can't run it from a saddle. That one sentence changes the course of history. For years, the ruins of Zhongdu just sit there, rotting. The Mongols rename it Yanjing and move on, because there's still a whole world left to crush. By the time Genghis dies in 1227, he's built the largest land empire the world has ever seen, and it's about to get even bigger. His grandson, Kublai Khan, isn't like the old-school Mongol warriors. He grew up respecting Chinese traditions. He realizes that if he wants to actually own China, he has to engage with their civilization, not just stomp it into the dirt. In 1261, he stands among the ruins of the old city. He likes the lakes. He likes the strategic view. He sees a future here. He decides to build. In 1271, Kublai founds the Yuan dynasty and starts digging the foundations for a massive new capital, just northeast of the old wreckage. He calls it Dadu, the great capital. But to the Mongols, it's Kambalik, the great residence of the Khan. Word reaches Europe through merchants who call it Kambaluk, and what they describe sounds like a miracle of engineering. Dadu is nearly double the size of the city it replaced. Its walls are 24 meters thick and guarded by 11 massive gates, 3 gates on each side, except for the north. Right in the center sits a pavilion that you'd recognize today as Beijing's Drum Tower. But the real showstopper? A chain of man-made lakes running straight through the city's heart. An engineer named Guo Shoujing diverted water from the mountains miles away just to keep the imperial city hydrated. Those lakes, the Beihai, Zhonghai, and Nanhai, are the exact same 6 seas you see in central Beijing today. Around 1270, a merchant from Venice named Marco Polo rolls into town. To say he was blown away would be an understatement. His stories would freak out European readers for the next several centuries. He told them about a city so massive, so rich, and so advanced, it felt like it was from another planet. Imagine massive geometric avenues, palaces dripping in gold and silk, markets overflowing with exotic goods. It was, quite literally, incommensurable, whether his stories were stretched or not, and trust me, scholars still fight over this. He was describing something real. This city, at the peak of Yuan power, was the most global place on Earth. They even extended the Grand Canal just to haul grain up from the fertile south. Everyone was here. Merchants, scholars, priests, Christians, rubbing shoulders with Muslims, and Buddhists in the busy streets of Dadu. For the 13th century, this court was shockingly diverse. But make no mistake, this was a conquest dynasty. Brutality was the law. Mongols sat at the top, and locals were second class. Crushing taxes, forced labor, resentment, it was all a slow-burn fuse. By the mid-1300s, everything broke. Floods, famine, and a plague, maybe the same Black Death currently gutting Europe. China exploded into rebellion. And in 1368, one man finally won. Zhu Yuanzhang, a former monk turned rebel leader, kicks the Mongols out and founds the Ming dynasty. The Mongols run north, retreating far behind the Great Wall. The city is renamed Beiping Northern Peace and stripped of its status as the capital. Zhu builds his power in Nanjing. It looks like Beijing's glory days are over, but not for long. The Ming start in the south. But the 4th emperor? He didn't wait for an inheritance. He took the throne through a brutal civil war. His name? Zhudi. He calls himself Yongle, perpetual happiness. A bit ironic for a man who just bypassed his father's carefully planned succession. The crown was meant for the eldest grandson, but Zhudi, the battle-hardened prince of the north, wasn't bowing to a kid. In 1399, he pulls the trigger on a civil war. By 1402, he's won. As for his nephew, the legitimate emperor, gone. Burned in the palace, maybe. Or perhaps he escaped in a disguise. Rumors of him being alive linger for decades, but no one knows. Now, Yongle has a throne, but zero legitimacy. Force kept him in power for now. Long term, though, he needs something much bigger. He decides to move the capital back to Beijing, his old power base, his home turf, the place he trusts. Plus, being in the north means he can stare down the Mongol threat directly across the border. In 1406, construction starts on a palace complex meant to shake the world. What they build over the next 14 years is the absolute pinnacle of architecture. The Forbidden City. Honestly, the scale of this project is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Over 1 million workers, 100,000 master craftsmen, 14 years of labor. They're hauling timber from jungles thousands of miles away. Marble is quarried from nearby mountains. Special golden bricks are fired in the elite kilns of Suzhou. Look at the imperial walkway, one solid slab of marble weighing 200 tons. To move it 43 miles, it takes 20,000 men nearly a full month. The result? 72 hectares of courtyards and halls. A 10-meter wall, 9,999.5 rooms. Why the half room? Because tradition says only heaven can have a full 10,000. The entire complex sits on a perfect north-south axis that still defines Beijing today. Yellow tiles for power, red walls for luck and protection. It's a sea of imperial branding. Every single measurement and orientation is locked in by the ancient rules of feng shui. It is the physical manifestation of a 5,000-year-old civilization. In 1421, the move becomes official. Beijing is the capital again. Yongle moves in, but only gets 3 years before dying on a military raid. But his creation? It's going to stand for another 500 years. The Ming years are a long, wild ride. 14 emperors rule from these halls over 2 centuries. There are moments of massive confidence and global expansion. Admiral Zheng, He leads massive fleets all the way to Arabia and Africa. Suddenly, China is the undisputed king of the ocean. Then, abruptly, it all stops. The voyages are cancelled, and China looks inward. They double down on the Great Wall. The iconic stone version you see in photos, that's mostly Ming. Most of it was built during the 15th and 16th centuries. Imagine thousands of miles of brick and watchtowers cutting through the mountains. Beijing sits just south of this massive wall. The final years of the Ming dynasty are pure chaos. Famines, peasant revolts, and Manchu warriors pressing in from the north. In 1644, the gates finally buckle. A rebel leader named Li Zicheng marches his army straight into the capital. The last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, walks to a hill north of the Forbidden City. You can still visit Jingshan Park today and hangs himself from a locust tree. The dynasty doesn't end with an invasion, but with a suicide and a rebel takeover. Li doesn't get to enjoy his win for long. A Ming general named Wu Sangui, who was supposed to be guarding the Great Wall, betrays the nation and opens the gates. That is when the Manchu army came pouring through. The Manchu had been building power for decades. By October 1644, their young leader, the Shunji Emperor, is crowned ruler of all China inside the Forbidden City. This is the start of the Qing dynasty, the final chapter of imperial China. But the Qing are smart conquerors. They don't just burn the Forbidden City down and start from scratch. They move in and rename a few buildings, choosing words that focus on harmony instead of just raw power. They put up bilingual nameplates in Chinese and Manchu, keeping the government gears turning exactly how the Ming had them. They knew that to rule China, you had to look like you belonged. In many ways, they became more traditional than the locals. The 1700s under the Kangxi, Yongle, and Qianlong emperors are the absolute peak. The empire swallows Tibet, Central Asia, and Mongolia. Beijing becomes the heart of a territory larger than anything China had ever seen. Just northwest of the city, they started work on a masterpiece. The Yuan Ming Yuan, or Garden of Perfect Brightness, becomes a massive world of lakes and palaces that takes 4 emperors 150 years to finish. European missionaries at the court even added Baroque architecture, fountains, and pavilions to the gardens. It was an incredible mix of East and West. But the 1800s? That is a different story entirely. Britain starts flooding China with opium to fix their trade balance. The Qing government tries to shut it down. In 1839, the First Opium War breaks out. China loses. The treaties that follow are a total humiliation. Ports are forced open, and taxes are set at crazy low levels to favor foreign goods. Then there is extraterritoriality, which basically meant foreigners in China didn't have to follow Chinese laws. People call this era the Century of Humiliation. And in 1856, the Second Opium War begins. By 1860, British and French troops are marching on Beijing. They reach the Yuan Ming Yuan, the palace that represented a century of artistic pride. They strip it bare, and then they burn it. The fire lasts for 3 days. The ruins still stand today as a deliberate memorial to what happened. But the Qing court was not just fighting off foreign armies. From the inside, the Taiping Rebellion kills 20 to 30 million people over 14 years. The dynasty barely survives, and only because they let regional warlords take over the fighting. Their central power is falling apart. By the end, the strongest person in China isn't even an emperor. It is Empress Dowager Cixi. She was the de facto ruler from 1861 to 1908, and she is incredibly complicated. She was powerful and strategic, but also deeply traditional. She would crush any reform movement that threatened her control. She even rebuilt a new summer palace, the Yihai Yuan, using money that was supposed to modernize the navy. Critics pointed this out when Japan crushed China in the 1895 Sino-Japanese War. People found out that Chinese naval shells were literally filled with concrete because the funds were diverted to palace gardens. By the late 1800s, the anger finally boils over. A group called the Boxers starts sweeping through northern China. They start burning foreign property to the ground. They target missionaries and Chinese Christians with one message: foreigners out. By June 1900, they are surrounding Beijing. Diplomats and families huddle for safety in the legation quarter, waiting for help that might not come. Cixi, after hesitating, sides with the Boxers and declares war on every foreign power at the same time. The siege of the legation quarter drags on for 55 days. Finally, an 8-nation alliance including the US and Japan sends 20,000 troops to storm Beijing on August 14, 1900. The Qing forces are wiped out. Cixi has to flee the city disguised as a peasant woman. Western troops loot the capital and begin executing anyone they suspect of being a boxer. Think of the horror, tens of thousands of civilians dead as foreign boots march through the forbidden city. For one surreal, fleeting moment, soldiers from 8 different nations are standing right in the Chinese emperor's throne room. Then comes the bill, the Boxer Protocol of 1901, forcing China to pay $333 million. It's a staggering debt, nearly equal to the empire's entire yearly revenue, payable over 39 years at 4% interest. Foreign troops are now a permanent fixture in Beijing. The very forts built to protect the capital, demolished. Cixi eventually crawls back to Beijing, a woman who has finally been humbled. In her sunset years, she actually starts passing the same reforms she once tried to kill. She scraps the ancient imperial exams, builds modern schools, lets the Han and Manchu marry, and even starts whispering about a constitution. But she dies in 1908, just one day after the Guangxu emperor, the man she kept as a prisoner for years, dies under some seriously suspicious circumstances. The entire weight of the throne drops onto a 2-year-old boy named Puyi. By 1911, a massive uprising in Wuchang sparks a revolution that catches fire across the country. On February 12, 1912, the 6-year-old emperor Puyi finally steps down. Just like that, over 2,000 years of imperial rule, a legacy stretching all the way back to the Qin dynasty, is over. The forbidden city becomes a hollow shell, a palace with no king. Then, in 1924, 18-year-old Puyi is kicked out of even that. He walks away with nothing but a suitcase. The new Republic of China is born into absolute, bloody chaos. No one can agree on what the country should be or who's in charge. Sun Yat-sen, the dreamer who spent his life fighting the Qing, takes the title of provisional president, but he almost immediately hands the keys to Yuan Shikai, the military muscle who forced the Qing to quit. Naturally, Yuan immediately tries to crown himself emperor. He dies in 1916 before his ego trip can really get moving. What follows is the brutal warlord era. Picture regional generals carving China into their own personal playgrounds. The central government in Beijing, nothing but a hollow fiction. Students and thinkers, absolutely disgusted by the mess, launched the May 4th movement in 1919. It's an explosion of anger starting in Tiananmen Square, fueled by the news that the Versailles Treaty handed Chinese land in Shandong to Japan as a thank you for their help in World War I. China fought for the winners. They got stabbed in the back anyway. That betrayal pushes a whole generation toward radical politics, including a young library worker at Peking University named Mao Zedong. By 1928, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government reunites much of the country and drags the capital back to Nanjing. Beijing is stripped of its name and called Beiping again, meaning Northern Peace. It's a demotion, pure and simple, but the city stays the beating heart of Chinese culture. Its ancient walls and narrow hutong alleys are still packed with artists, reformers, and universities. Then, on the night of July 7th, 1937, shots ring out near the Lugu Bridge. It's the same bridge built 750 years ago, during the Jin dynasty. This Marco Polo Bridge incident is the exact excuse Japan needs to invade. Within weeks, Japanese soldiers are marching through Beiping, a city that survived centuries of war, falls this time with barely a shrug of resistance. The nationalist government had already pulled its troops south. The Japanese occupation drags on for nearly 8 years. The raw, daily reality for the people living there, the checkpoints, the curfews, the constant, grinding humiliation, the choices between surviving and resisting, it's a story that still hasn't been fully told in the West. The nightmare finally ends in August 1945, when Japan surrenders. But the vacuum is filled by a massive civil war between Mao Zedong's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. This conflict had been simmering for decades, but now it's a total inferno. The nationalists are exhausted, broke, and rotting with corruption. Mao's armies? They're disciplined, fast, and backed by a sea of angry, rural, poor. By 1948 and 49, the communists are winning the big, decisive fights all over China. In January 1949, Beiping falls to the communists without much of a struggle, leaving the city's bones mostly intact. At exactly 3 in the afternoon on October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong climbs to the top of the Tiananmen Gate. This is the Gate of Heavenly Peace, the massive southern entrance to the Forbidden City, a stone witness that has watched emperors and invaders come and go for 500 years. Today, it hears Mao announce that the People's Republic of China is officially open for business. Tens of thousands of people are screaming in the square below. The 5-starred red flag is hoisted up. A new anthem blares. Mao's voice crackles across every radio in the country. The city gets its real name back. Beijing, northern capital, restored to its former glory. China's new capital is also its oldest continuous survivor. The decades that followed were never easy. They never are for a country this big or a city this old. China started out poor, but they clawed their way back to wealth and global power. In 2008, the world finally came to Beijing for the Summer Olympics. Picture a city built by a Mongol conqueror, refined by Ming emperors, bled dry by foreign invaders, and then clawed back by a revolution. That is Beijing. It is finally opening its gates to the world, but not as the city you think you know. You have seen the neon glow of the bird's nest and the shimmering water cube, where the past and the future do not just coexist, they collide. It is a place that presents itself as ancient and high-tech all at once. When 4 billion people watched the opening ceremony back in 2008, they were not just watching a show, they were witnessing a cultural self-declaration on a scale the world had never seen. But to understand why they screamed so loud, you have to look at what they almost lost. Today, more than 21 million people are packed into this urban sprawl. 8 UNESCO World Heritage Sites are tucked within the city limits. You have the haunting silence of the Forbidden City and the jagged, stone spine of the Great Wall. Then there is the Summer Palace, the Temple of Heaven, the Ming Tombs, and the ancient Peking Man site at Jurchens. Even the Grand Canal ends its long journey here. This is now the world's corporate throne, holding more Fortune 500 headquarters than any other city on the planet. Yet, hidden beneath the towers of glass, a secret world is still breathing. You can ride subway lines so advanced they would make most Western capitals blush. But look closer. Tucked between the skyscrapers are the Khitans' ancient, narrow alleyways that survived the imperial age and the chaos of the warlords. They survived the Japanese occupation and even the fires of the Cultural Revolution. They are still there, though their numbers are dwindling, squeezed tight by a forest of steel. If you know where to look, you can still find courtyard homes that date all the way back to the Ming dynasty. The central heart of the city still beats along the north-south axis. Kublai Khan drew in the dirt 700 years ago. The drum tower that marked the center of his capital, Dadu, still stands tall. The lakes he dug out are still there. Their names shifted over the centuries, but their shapes remain almost exactly as he left them. And the Forbidden City? It still sits at the absolute center of the universe. It rests exactly where Emperor Yongle placed it 600 years ago. In 3 millennia, this place went from a dusty frontier outpost to a provincial town, then to a conqueror's prize. It became the seat of the greatest empire on earth. Then came the fall. It was humiliated, occupied, and stripped bare. Now, it is the capital of the most populous nation in human history. It has been burned, rebuilt, named, and renamed, lost, and then reclaimed. Here is the truth about Beijing, if you are willing to look at it honestly. Cities, just like people, are not just one thing. They are the sum of everything that has ever happened to them. They are every wall that was ever built, and every brick that was torn down. They are every palace that burned, and every emperor who sat on the dragon throne, and every peasant who could only watch from the outside. That history is not just locked away in some museum. It is right there in the streets. It is in the very alignment of the city. It is in the cold stones of the drum tower and the tiles of the Forbidden City. And it is in the skeletal ruins of the old summer palace, standing open to the sky. If you made it this far into the story, thank you for watching. Do us a favor and hit that like and subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who actually care about history, people like you.